Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We have quite a bit to cover, so I don't want to eat into our time any more than necessary. I think you saw maybe that Ann had posted some information about asking questions. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type in questions, and we will try to address those at the end of the webinar, or somebody will answer them online. So let me just welcome you on behalf of the LoRa Alliance to this webinar. I think it's pretty obvious that the post-COVID-19 world is going to have a big impact on how workplaces are managed, and that's not only in in terms of legal ramifications or legal compliance, but also in terms of employers convincing their employees that the workplace is safe to return to. So I think this is a very timely webinar, and you're going to hear some good LoRa-based IoT solutions from all the panelists that can assist companies in doing so. So just very briefly, let me tell you a little bit about the LoRa Alliance if you're not familiar. LoRa Alliance, it's a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to standardizing and promoting the LoRaWAN protocol. The LoRaWAN protocol is an open specification that is freely downloadable. Anybody can access it and build products to it or build a solution. You don't need any licensing permission or permission from anybody to build the LoRaWAN network. As you can see, the companies that are involved are quite, sort of name brands, familiar to everybody. In case you don't know Machine Q, that's part of Comcast. But there's many major carriers involved, and also suppliers of all sorts, comprising the 500 members. The standard has been around for about 5 years, and you can see there's been widespread adoption, and we're continuing to see growth in the ramp every year that goes by. If you can move to the next one, Ann. To sort of level set where LoRa fits in the wireless communication space versus other protocols you're probably familiar with. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are familiar to everybody. The advantage of those is that they're very high bandwidth. The disadvantage is that they're very, very short range. Cellular is quite high bandwidth and very good range, but it's not particularly great for battery life in general. And it's generally served by outdoor base stations. LoRa sort of sits dedicated to IoT below that, low bandwidth, but extremely long range and very power efficient. You can go to the next one, Ann. And so the applicability within buildings, I kind of boil it down to these four main points, which is the power consumption I mentioned. If you think about where these IoT devices might be placed, it's going to kill the ROI if you have to go change the batteries. You can deploy a network completely independent of corporate IT infrastructure, or you can work within the corporate IT infrastructure. But this is an important point when we talk about, having to probably quickly deploy systems in buildings and, having to work through maintaining IT security could cause a delay in that. You can build a private network, or you can use a service provided by a public network provider, and there's a very large ecosystem already established. You saw over 500 members in the Alliance. Next slide. So in terms of the high impact use cases, this is what we've seen kind of broadly group them into maintenance and safety, sustainability, and employee productivity. The talks today do overlap with some of these, but primarily we're going to be focusing on the maintenance and safety part, things like predictive cleaning and how to maintain social distancing and how to maintain or determine that your desks have been properly cleaned, things like that. So with that, I'll move on to introducing the panelists. You can read there. Microshare is a service provider providing solutions to office buildings, primarily hospitals, things like that. Neston is going to talk about some of their contact locating and tracing applications. And then we've got EveryNet, My Devices, and Capgemini coming up next. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike Moran to start, and Mike, take it away.
Thank you very much, Byron, and thank you for everybody that is joining from around the world. I've been asked to give a kind of overview and set the stage for my colleagues who will follow with much more specific use cases. From Microshare's standpoint, we take a very holistic view of this. We almost everything that Byron showed you on the LoRa use case slide there are things that Microshare does. But I'm going to get a little bit macro with you to start. So as this slide says, when history surprises, the consequences can take years to emerge. This is a major surprise. In 1929, of course, the Great Depression started. But over time, it became clear that there was going to be a reordering of US society and governance, that this remade what we think of economics. Economics changed drastically because of this. And of course, it set the stage for the rise of fascism and Hitler in Europe. In 1949, you see Mao there proclaiming victory and the establishment of the communist state in China. Who knew that this was going to emerge as the kind of linchpin of global manufacturing and globalization in this century? It took years for that to become clear. In 1991, the wall came down. Everyone celebrated the end of the Cold War, well, most people. But what we didn't really get at first is we also added 3 billion people to the global workforce. This was the moment of globalization. And everybody suddenly was competing with many, many, many more people in many more places. In 2001, after those attacks, I was in New York for that. It was terrifying. There was talk of people leaving high density buildings and tall buildings. Security was ramped up all over the world. But the longer term consequences only became clear later. It really destroyed the fabric of the Middle East, the reaction of the United States and its allies. And it basically drained US leadership credibility over the years. It really hurt and changed the world geopolitically. Finally, 2008, of course, this led to the Great Depression, the Great Recession. But if you look in the rearview mirror, it was also kind of the lighting of the fuse for populism. It was the reaction that mattered. The reaction focused on saving big facilities and big banks instead of the average guy, and the average guy was really pissed about that. So we don't always know what history is going to bring. This time, and I think you can go to the next slide, Ann. This time, I think the change will be fast, deep, and lasting. The economic damage is general. It's not confined to a sector or region or particular nation. Pandemics don't obey economic laws, and they don't obey presidential decrees. They burn out when herd immunity or a vaccine is discovered. So we have some serious uncertainty here. The implications go directly to the heart of corporate and landlord duty of care, raising all sorts of ethical and liability issues that do not have precedent. I was speaking to people around the United States yesterday, and almost every state has a different take on whether an employer, for instance, is liable for someone who comes back to work under some form of duress, like if you don't come back, your job is gone, and whether they can then turn and sue the employer. So these are big questions that have not been settled in any jurisdictions. Density itself, and this is really important, is an issue here. At least until COVID is contained, it's not a coincidence, for instance, that my home state, New Jersey, which is the densest state in the United States, leads the United States in per capita deaths and per capita cases of COVID-19. Density is an issue, and we have to deal with that. Corporates, facilities managers, public institutions, REITs will exit this crisis financially weakened. They'll be looking to downsize real estate exposure. And any of them who think they can just get away with, turning up the cleaning frequency of the crews that are in there right now is sleeping through this crisis. However, and next slide, Ann, there are answers. And at my company, Microshare, we've been saying it for years, clean equals safe. Nothing is new about this concept, but with quite modest investment, any building, whether it was built yesterday or during the Black Plague, can be converted from an inert brick and mortar structure to a living, breathing, data producing asset. Next slide. And why is that important? Well, the market largely ignored that message for years. It was considered a nice to have by asset managers, landlords. Now it's a matter of life and death and liability and reputation. At the beginning of this crisis, I did a commercial real estate scenario analysis for Microshare, and we came up with 3 scenarios. You see them here. They may be a little tough to read, so I'll read through. Our main scenario, scenario A, was that the crisis would spawn a major reassessment by large corporate tenants as well as investors. Valuations for commercial real estate were going to plummet, and there would be a spike in delinquencies, fear of density, infection risk, and it would weigh heavily on the office market. I'm not going to go to the other scenarios. The full scenario analysis is there in that URL if you'd like to see it. It's not happy reading. The actual darker scenario is not our main scenario. So it gives you an idea where we are here. But the point of all this is building owners, corporate real estate portfolio managers, you need to do something. This is not just, hey, come back to work. It's time to go back in the water, as the mayor from Jaws would say. Who are they going to trust now? Where are the incentives aligned? This is a really important question. And a lot of the solutions that my colleagues, they're going to more specific solutions that they're going to describe later in this presentation will address some of these issues. Next slide, please. So here's the good news, right? We can fight back. Pandemics are inevitable. Their demise is also inevitable. So the great news here is that the Internet of Things and smart building professionals have been proposing for years solutions to this exact problem. This is not just about contact tracing. I mean, let's face it, if you come out of this, if you own a big building or a facility, and all you've done for your workforce, tenants, customers, is told them that they wear some kind of a badge or download an app so you can trace everything they do, you are missing. You are totally missing. So you need to think holistically. The world has to become a safer place. And the good news here is that all the things you would do to make your facility ready for a post-COVID world, whether it's forced by regulation or ethics or just the desires of your occupants, are the exact same things you would do to, for instance, generate a sustainable place. And in fact, to save money on poorly performing assets, things like energy and wasted water and how you process trash. So next slide, please. What we're hoping here is that we can, use this as a wake-up call. Commercial real estate is notoriously a laggard when it comes to the adoption of technology. We know this very well, Microshare. As I said, we've been saying this for years, and now suddenly we're on the front page of the Financial Times. This is the moment for this revolution in building safety, building performance, building sustainability, and putting wellness of the occupants, whether they're tenants, staff, or customers, front and center. So we've got at Microshare a 6-point approach to this. This is very much the specific COVID moment approach. Obviously, there are other capabilities like air quality monitoring, water usage, temperature and humidity control. You can, monitor decibels and brightness and footfall and refrigerator consistent use, etc. But for COVID-19, for this moment, these are the things that I think lead to the facility that your occupants want to be in. One, you have occupancy monitoring, and this is vital. Knowing how your space is utilized is a prerequisite for understanding the kind of attention any given section of it needs, the ROI it delivers over time. Let's face it, a lot of you who are in the building management or in the portfolio management business are looking to downsize, right? How do you know which rooms are actually being used and are bringing ROI? Predictive cleaning, number 2, we have found that in our predictive cleaning solutions, which involve multiple IoT sensors and going over LoRaWAN gateways in places like washrooms and other common areas, locker rooms, cafeteria areas, this is actually reduced in hospital environments infection rates. This is an enormous thing that already the healthcare industry understood the value of, because antibiotic-resistant bacteria were an issue. Now with viruses, you have the same issue. Viruses are left on things that people touch. How often was that bathroom used? How often was it cleaned? Is anything wrong? Asset zoning, number 3, is about locating equipment, the mobile equipment that can be very expensive, but very, very important to the successful and productive operating of a facility. Universal contact tracing, in fact, our solution there, the thing that was on the front page of the FT recently, that is actually drawn right from asset zoning. That is the personalization, essentially, of asset zoning, to track people in a space where density is impossible to avoid, so that you don't have unknown exposure. And there are good reasons not to do that with smartphones. For instance, the elderly, the poor, precisely the most vulnerable people often don't have smartphones. Okay, and I'm just going to let you folks read this. I'm sure the slides will be made available after this presentation. But basically, the final thing I'll say is, you're about to see solutions to these problems from people around the world. The most important thing is that this puts people in the center. The building is not the focus at the moment. If your building is your focus, I think you're gonna be seen as out of touch with what has just happened to the planet.